Makers Live on LinkedIn is a space for everyone, where we can come together to shatter convention, get deeper into how leaders are made, increase women's media influence, improve our health physically and mentally, ignite corporate responsibility, and inform our advocacy. We're here to make a statement, all in service of an equitable future in the workplace and beyond. Tune in from wherever you are. It's time for Makers Live on LinkedIn. Today's topic is simple. With the Olympics over, where women athletes actually got the recognition they deserved, what's next for women in sports? I'm excited for this conversation moderated by Caroline Fenton, senior reporter at Yahoo Sports. Before we start talking about the future of women in sports, let's look at where we've been.
There's no way a woman can play tennis with a good man tennis player. This is a battle of the sexes.
I knew I had to play. It was about history. It was about social change.
The United States of America are crowned champions of the world.
When we won our second World Cup in 2019, to the reverberating, echoing chants of equal pay, was when I realized that the greatest part about women's sports is women.
There should be no limit to what girls and women can do.
The people who inspire me are also inspired by what I'm doing.
When you oppress people, either by gender, by race, sexual orientation, you do that and the doors become ajar. They will fly open and they will come, and they have.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Makers Live on LinkedIn. I'm Caroline Fenton. I'm a senior reporter for Yahoo Sports, and I am so honored and I feel so privileged to be here today. I mean, I'm still have chills and goosebumps from watching that introductory video to continue this conversation, a really important conversation that we're going to have today, to not just reflect upon the change and the amount of momentum that women's sports have, but also to talk about where we go next, because it's not enough. We all want more. So I'm so excited to be here, and I am so excited to have you all with us. And we're here together right after the Olympics, where we saw women earn 67 of the United States' total 127 medals in Paris. That's over half. We saw swimmer Katie Ledecky become the most decorated female U.S. Olympian of all time. We saw Simone Biles and all of her magic become the most decorated American gymnast with 9 Olympic medals. And that just scratches the surface of what women were able to do and accomplish in Paris. We saw so many other women reach the pinnacle of their respective sports. We saw women encouraging one another and inspiring all of us at home watching throughout the process. And I truly could talk about the Olympics all day long, but now that the Olympics are officially behind us, we have the Paralympics coming up later this month. The WNBA season is resuming, and we have college sports coming up in just a few weeks as we kick off the fall season. We're in the perfect spot to talk about what comes next for women in sports. New opportunities are popping up from the court to the boardroom to the field to the league office and so much more, with women athletes and business leaders at the center. So let's just pull up some stats to see exactly what we're talking about here, just to see some context of the momentum that we've seen for women in sports and women's sports. In the first month of the WNBA season in May, the league saw the highest ever viewership and game attendance. Each game in the month of May averaged 1.32 million viewers, which is nearly a 300% increase from 2023. I mean, it's seismic increase in viewership there. And the Women's College World Series in softball, it set a new record for viewership at 2 million viewers this year, a 24% increase from 2023. 222 women are working in full-time coaching or football operations roles in the NFL. That's a 141% hike from 2020. 141%. That is crazy. And the 2023 Women's World Cup generated $570 million in revenue. I could go on and on and on with all of the examples, but as you can tell just from that small sample size, there is a massive cultural and financial influence. The momentum is happening in women's sports, and it's turning into a movement. It's something that endures and inspires generations to come. More media coverage, more community, more support. We want all of it. So today we'll hear from some women with deep ties to the sports world on their visions for the future. So I'm so excited and honored to welcome in some fabulous women that are joining us today, some of our panelists. First up, we have the incredible Elle Duncan. So a little bit about Elle. A sports-obsessed Georgia girl got her opportunity of a lifetime, making her SportsCenter debut in 2016, which opened the door for so many more opportunities in her career. Ella's anchored ESPN's coverage of women's NCAA basketball, WNBA Countdown, and the March Madness tournament. She regularly appears on the daytime panel show Around the Horn, and she's also the co-host of the Elle Duncan Show podcast and the author of a new children's book called For You, I Will, which celebrates the unique bond between mothers and daughters. Elle is also a tireless champion of all moms as a mother of 2 under 5 herself. So everybody enjoy sleeping in on behalf of Elle Duncan, who probably doesn't get to do a whole lot of that these days. And one more thing about Elle that is very important to know about her. Do not ever, ever get between her and a basket of lemon pepper wings.
Your facts.
Facts. Elle,
Facts, Caroline.
you're the best. Welcome in. You've been a champion for women's sports, and we are so incredibly happy to have you here. Fresh off the first take set. Literally,
Yes.
What can't she do? Before we bring in the rest of our panelists, Elle, just a couple of examples or maybe one thing that really stood out to you from the Paris Olympics.
Oh man. Well, I love, thank you, first of all, Caroline, and thank you for the distinction of, I just got off set. Normally I have like a really nice home studio like Caroline. She is putting me to shame. I'm the TV person and she is putting me totally to shame. I'm just like in some random office. I hope someone doesn't come knocking.
You look fabulous. Don't even say that.
Thank you. But the thing that I loved, I saw this stat yesterday when we were sort of talking about this women's or the women in this Olympics, which the French had aimed for this to be the most gender equitable Olympics ever. And they came very, very close with 48% of the athletes being female. But I thought this was just such a great way to highlight how the American women, how much they showed up. If you took just the medals that the American women won and put them up against every other country, we would come in third, only behind the United States and China. Just the women of America. That's how impressive they were. It was incredible to see. But a fun fact for you is that 4 straight years now, or actually 4 Olympics now, it has been the women that have carried the medal count. There you go.
Chills. It is so astonishing just putting it that way, comparing to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
American women were dominating in
Yes.
the Olympics. So love that. Thank you so much for that, Elle. And also very excited to bring in our second panelist, Jayna Hefford. Jayna is the Senior Vice President of Hockey Operations at the Professional Women's Hockey League. She is a perfect and shining example of perseverance and excellence. She competed in 5 Winter Olympic Games, claiming 4 consecutive gold medals for Team Canada, and one of only 12 women elected to the Hockey Hall of Fame. She's transitioned her on-ice career into one of elite executive leadership. Her priorities at the PWHL, which debuted in January with a splash, and it's heading into its second season with a ton of momentum. Her priorities are innovation, consistency, and creating a positive culture and emphasizing the importance of diversity. Jayna, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome in. It has been such a blast and so inspiring to watch the PWHL grow in popularity. And I know, we all know that things are just getting started for you and the PWHL as a whole. So I'll ask you the same question that I asked Elle. Anything that stood out to you from the Paris Olympics?
Well, I had such a fun time watching the Olympic Games. I had the opportunity to compete in 5 games, as you mentioned, in my career. And now I have 3 young kids. And this was the first Olympics that they really got into. And I thought that that was so fun to be able to sit, watch the Olympic Games with my family. They wanted to watch it every night. They found new sports that, and as did I, that I had never seen before. And just, I think the stories that come along with the Olympic Games and the athletes of the Olympic Games are just so valuable. So for me, it was the memory of just really enjoying the games with my kids and having them to start to learn about the great qualities that the Olympic Games brings out.
What a special memory to be able to share with them. And I can also attest to the first Olympics that I remember. I still hold those memories and all of those athletes in such high regard. So I love that you were able to create that environment for your kids. Let's jump right in. Elle, Jayna, you are fantastic. Thank you for being here. We'll be discussing the importance of storytelling, how athletes use their unique leadership skills in the way that we can start thinking beyond just the game. So we'll take some questions later. Please use the chat to add your comments. Feel free to send some questions in. We'll absolutely get to those. But first, I have some questions. Elle, we'll start with you, our media queen, about media influence. So we know that media is all about the stories, the numbers, inspiration, and representation. So Deloitte forecasts that in 2024, for the first time ever, women's elite sports will generate a revenue that surpasses $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion, and broadcast rights are a really big part of that. So from your perspective in the media, how can media outlets continue to improve the quality and also quantity of coverage for women's sports outside of peak events?
This is a great question. It's one that I get asked a lot. Actually, I don't get asked this specific question a lot. I get asked a lot, like, how can we make things, more equitable? How can we make things? And I first want to start with, we need to identify and remember when we're asking ourselves and making these decisions in these offices to remember the difference between equality and equity, right? Equality is sameness. Equity is fairness. So while a lot of media companies are feeling really good, and they should, about how they're platforming women's sports, where they are lacking and where I think we need to make the most improvement is the equity in how we cover them. And I'm going to use one specific example. We had a situation, obviously Caitlin Clark has been a bit of a lightning rod in the women's basketball space, but we had a situation where we had a lot of really big name talking heads who are unfamiliar with the women's basketball space. And that's okay. That is totally okay, because equality is, even if you don't know much about it, you still need to talk about it, right? Because that's what we do with these talking heads in sports. But the problem is that they don't have sort of the bandwidth or understanding or knowledge or any of the nuance behind it. So the particular situation that I'm talking about is when Kennedy Carter threw down Caitlin Clark, and it became this big giant, referendum on how all the women of the W hate on Caitlin Clark and they don't like her. And this is an example. And oh my gosh, they're so nasty to her and they're so petty. And the thing is that the people that had been in this space, the women that had covered this, the men that had covered women's basketball for some time, knew that there was a lot more to the story about Kennedy Carter and some of her past transgressions and some of her decision making. But on the surface, if you don't know any of those things, because you have not covered women's basketball, because you are new, and that's okay, all are welcome, you treated it as a sort of singular situation as opposed to having the full context behind it. I think that where we need to make the most movement is, because the game itself is taking care of itself. We don't have to beg people anymore to platform women. Like, the strategy is there. You don't have to make some moral decision because you came from a mother. None of that. We don't have to argue any of those things anymore, because the proof is in the money, the resources, the profit, all the things that you just laid out. But the thing we've got to do better about is not going, oh, well, we're doing right by these women because we're putting them and their conversations and their subjects and whatever on these big shows with these big talking heads, as opposed to having something more than stunt casting. We need to make sure that the women that are covering these respective sports are given the platforms, the resources, the promotion. We need to normalize them as analysts, because they by nature will bring a unique perspective. I think sometimes we get too linear. It's too on the nose. It's like stunt casting. Let's have a female-centered desk and talk about the females, and let's have a female show where everyone behind the scenes is a female and everyone. And I don't think that we normalize the idea that we are pervasive in this space. We are everywhere. And what we need to do is just start doing a better job of platforming women, because by nature, their opinion and perspectives are going to be skewed more female. So for me, it's much more about being intentional about staffing. Who are talking about these stories? Are we making sure that there's a bench, right? There is 37 different reporters to cover football. And I'll use ESPN as an example here. If 10 reporters aren't available to join my show, we'll go to the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th. But when it comes to women's sports, a lot of times it is a very short bench. And so you've got one or two people maybe that have the acumen and understanding and knowledge to tackle something. And then what do? We just give it to anyone to talk about. And I think we're just doing these women a disservice by shortchanging them with the people that actually cover them. So for me, that is the most significant change that I want to see. I want it to be a destination. Right now, you don't get paid any extra to do women's sports. You have to do male sports as well. That's how you justify your pay. And we heard Sue Bird say it a few months ago. I'm looking forward to the day when you get paid simply because you do cover women's sports. It's not an additive. It's not an add-on. So for me, that's where I think we need to be more intentional.
Very, very well said. And I think we're at a point in the coverage of women's sports where it's not just about being there. It's not just about the exposure. It's also about the substance. How can we be intentional of telling these teams, these athletes, these women's stories? Very well said. Thank you, Elle. And Jayna, I'll ask you the same question. Maybe your perspective with the PWHL and working with broadcasting partners, how you can get more eyes and more intentional stories behind the PWHL.
Yeah, I think, first of all, so well said, Elle. Appreciate so much of that insight that you provided. So I'll lean a little bit more into our story, the PWHL, when I think about how we improve the media coverage. And for us, it continues to come back to consistent visibility and accessibility. And we took the route of, we had national broadcast partners in Canada. We had regional broadcast partners in the United States. We were free for everyone around the world to watch on YouTube. And those were some big decisions that we made. But for us, it really paid off to have that kind of accessibility for people to see our games. They didn't get stuck behind a paywall and really made it difficult for people to find us. We had to make it easy to gain fans. And that can't be a long-term plan, of course. At some point, you want to be able to bring in revenue on rights deals. But for us, as we got off the ground, the accessibility was so important. And over the 5 months, we accumulated over 112,000 subscribers on YouTube. So we saw that proof. And I think women's sports in general have proved that there's an audience to fit when you can match the investment behind it. So as we continue to invest more, we need media partners also to invest more and continue to provide those platforms for us. And then leaning in towards the media narratives. And again, I think Elle said that so well. And my example would have been similar in terms of how we saw the WNBA and Caitlin Clark portrayed earlier in the season. And when I think to our experiences in hockey, for many years, it was that Canada-US rivalry. And it was the same stories that kept being recycled, and typically often the same athlete stories that continued to get recycled. And meanwhile, we had 40 to 50 women who had incredible stories. And oftentimes the media that didn't know the game as well, much like what Elle said, would always revert back to telling those same stories. And many times it came back to who had a brother in the NHL or whose dad played in the NHL. And it was less about the women themselves and their stories. And I see that starting to change. And of course, we have the media members that are champions of women's sports and work so hard every day to create new and better content. But we still have some media members that will rely on what's always been done. And I think continuing to encourage those members to learn the new stories, learn the new athletes, because there's so many incredible ones out there.
100%. And while some of that nuance might be nutritious to a broadcast, hey, this brother, this uncle, this dad played in the NHL, that's great and all, but what about her? What about her story? But what about her journey? What about the rest of the team? Absolutely, very well said. And I kind of want to move on to corporate responsibility and leadership skills that we see women in sports really practice on a daily basis. And Jayna, I'll go ahead and start with you on this one. We see athletes rise as leaders in sports organizations, and global research indicates that women athletes are effective corporate executives and entrepreneurs due to the skills that they developed while competing, and whether that's in a sports organization or really just in life in general. So what are some strengths that you've developed through playing sports or observing elite athletes that have influenced or benefited your leadership style?
Well, obviously, we have an audience here that probably doesn't need to talk about the value of participating in sport, especially for young girls. So when I think about the leadership skills that I developed, they're pretty simple, but they're also pretty foundational. So when you think about teamwork and the ability to collaborate and work with people and communicate, that's something that I lean on every day in my work, in my personal life. You think about the work ethic and the adversity you go through as an athlete. And, I was speaking to some young girls yesterday at a camp and said, you watched all these amazing Olympians on television the last 2 weeks. Every single one of them has had a bad day. Every one of them has probably gone through an injury or a bad performance and had to bounce back. So that idea of resilience and and in many cases, potentially being underestimated and trying to continue to prove that you belong or prove that you can win and you can excel at the highest level. So those are all skills that I bring to my daily life that I've learned through sport. And at the time, didn't know I was learning it, but I'm so thankful for those experiences. And then when I think about what I bring now to the PWHL, we have a really strong focus. I think you mentioned off the bat around our innovation and our technology. And we've tried to really change the game and present it differently. And in that understanding that we don't have to be the female version of the NHL. We can be our own league. We can be different. And those differences are being celebrated and really well received. We created a new rule in our game called the jailbreak rule. And when a team scores, when they're shorthanded, they actually get their player out of the penalty box to get back to 5-on-5 hockey. So things like that. We did a draft elimination point system where you could actually win the first draft pick opposed to lose your way to get the first draft pick. So we're really trying to understand how we can engage our fans in a bigger way. And we know that we're an entertainment product and there's a lot of competition out there. So we love the game of hockey. We never want to change the traditionalism of that, but we want to find ways to keep our fans engaged in new ways and chart our own path for women in this sport.
I love that you pointed out that women's sports, the PWHL, it's not an extension of men's sports. It's a separate entity in and of itself. The PWHL is its own league and deserves to get the recognition as such. So I'm so happy that you pointed that out. Elle, I'll ask you the same question. Your experience growing up playing sports and also how you've seen maybe your former athlete counterparts, how sports have really shaped who they are now in the workplace.
I laughed when Jayna said that because I just want to share something really quick when we talk about one of the ways that we've sort of moved past what supporting women's sports used to look like. I asked Gino Ariema, humble brag, when I was covering the Final Four this year, like, what do you think it is, apart from, again, platforming and giving them airtime and all that, like, why is all this happening right now? Right. And he said something that I think that Jayna just hit on was that for so long, women's sports always had to be validated by men. Right. Even Diana Taurasi, he brought her up. He was like, people used to love Diana Taurasi when she was at UConn and they'd say things like, she plays like Kobe, right? She's the white mamba. She plays like insert man. And I think that he felt like the biggest difference that he's seen in his 40 years in women's sports is that there is a true appreciation for the women and the roles that they play and the sport that they play. And it isn't about needing some sort of outside validation or saying things, we used to sell things like she's the Steph Curry of, the WNBA. And now it's like, well, maybe Steph Curry is the Caitlin Clark of the NBA. Right. So I just wanted to say that that stood out to me. And I think it's standing out to a lot of luminaries in this space as well, is that for the first time in a long time, we don't need validation from men to feel like the product is great. For me personally, I really echo everything Jayna said. I love working with athletes. I apologize. I don't mean to denigrate anyone that never played a sport that might be listening, but it's just unparalleled to me. Apart from, yes, the teamwork and collaboration part, the losing part, right? You lose, you play sports and you lose, and it's about how you rally and how you learn. It's about taking feedback, right? Like when you are being coached, it is not always all positive. Sometimes it's constructive, sometimes it's not, but like how you receive information, how you apply that feedback, like those things are so important in the space that we're in. And for me personally, the thing that I use all the time that is a sort of direct influence from my upbringing in sports, I was a softball player. I was a utility player. Like my whole life, I was the girl that you could plug where you needed. Jack of all trades, maybe master of none. But like, if we needed a third baseman on that team because our all-state third baseman graduated, like I would play third base. If you needed, a big hit in that space, like I could find my way on base. I might not hit a home run, but I would do it. And I think that I apply that same exact thing to what I currently do now. I look at the show, the situation, the panel, whatever it is. And I try to figure out where can I serve this role the best? What does this situation need? What does this studio need? What does this team need? What does this segment need? And I try to figure out how I can, use whatever from my bag of tricks and supply that. So I think that's something that I certainly learned, is just versatility and learning how to play a role. Now that obviously doesn't apply if you played a sport that was not a team sport, but I've just learned that like through sports that you're never as good or as bad as you say that you are. That versatility is key and that collaboration is key. There's not a single thing that I do on any of the shows that I show up on that I don't collaborate with someone. And when you talk about, Caroline, like what that looks like, even working with athletes, the cool thing is I work with some of the most famous and incredible athletes of all time. And they have that same exact, we are a team mentality. And so even this morning, I was going to make a point on First Take and everybody was against me. And so the little bit of like self-doubt creeps in, right? You're like, why am I the only one in the room that thinks that this is a big deal and they don't think that this is a big deal? So I went to Dan Orlovsky, who is a trusted football mind, who I work with, who I love and is a friend. And I was like, Dan, am I crazy here? Because I think that the Jets do really need Hassan Reddick and everyone else is saying that they don't. And he stepped right in. He's like, get him. Here's what I would say. Here's what I think. I agree with you. And so there's just this idea of everyone wanting to see their teammate win that is really, really special. Of course, there's a couple of bad apples, and certainly we hear about those at times. But for the most part, working with former athletes is just, it's truly like working on a team that I have my whole entire life and everyone supporting each other. It's great. The collaboration aspect is important.
And even in that example that you just gave of offering up a point that maybe not everyone else agreed with, like that's taking a risk. That's scary. Yeah. And that's really the first time in any young kid's life, the first opportunity that they really get to take risks, to put themselves out there, to build that confidence is in sports. Like Miley Cyrus said in a recent media availability, legends are scared, but they do things anyways. They do the things that make them scared anyway. And sports are a perfect opportunity to be able to do that kind of in a controlled environment, starting from when you're a kid all the way until you're playing in the PWHL, is being scared to offer up an opinion, to play in a game, to play in the Olympics, but doing it anyway and laying that foundation of confidence. So I love that, everything that you all just said. And one more question for you all before we get to questions from the audience. So just a reminder to everybody watching and listening, feel free to put those questions in the question bar that you're watching on LinkedIn. So Elle, I'll start with you for this one. We've talked a lot about the games itself, but I want to go beyond that. I mean, both of you have taken your careers to the next levels, but not without support and collaboration. We've seen pay equity as a big topic for women's sports in recent years. So what are some strategies that you've taken to get people to invest in your belief in women's sports?
Well, I mean, I think enthusiasm goes a really long way. Like if you believe, I'm in the business of selling storylines and enthusiasm. And one of the things that I say to my show group when they're sort of, what are we going to talk about? Or like the storylines aren't obvious. Yeah. We just heard Jayna say it. They go to the same bag of tricks. Like when she was saying that, I just kept thinking Hillary Knight.
Oh, I think we may have lost Elle. We can unmute Elle.
Can you hear me?
There we go.
Okay.
Got you now.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just kept thinking Hillary Knight. I was like, if someone doesn't know anything about like women's hockey, they're like, but I do know her. But I think that one of the ways that I sell sports to people is just by sheer enthusiasm. Whenever I challenge my show group, I go, the same ability that you have to sell me on a big Thursday night baseball game in May, when we all know it doesn't matter, take that same exact enthusiasm that sometimes is manufactured and search for storylines. That is our job. Our job is to tell you about the things that you don't know. Our job is to table set. And I hope that by, having an opportunity to share with people why I'm so excited and enthusiastic about the upcoming women's basketball season, right? Like I'm hearing a lot of right now some sort of hesitance, like it's been great, but like the Caitlin Clark effect, like it could have an impact in women's basketball. And you said it off the top, Caroline. The numbers don't lie. Caitlin Clark doesn't play softball. She's not a gymnast. Like she doesn't do any of these things, right? Women's college basketball is going to be so freaking exciting next year. We've got Paige Beckers. We've got Juju Watkins. The WNBA season is getting ready. The second half of the season is getting ready to tip off. We've got incredible storylines that involve Caitlin Clark, but also Asia Wilson, who's having just one of the most incredible dominant runs we've seen since Shaq won MVP in the NBA. And I'm not using his name as a validation. I'm using his name because no one had a season like him either. So I think it's just really about reminding people of the joy in sports and the petty storylines and the triumphant storylines. And like, that's where we sell this, is by doing our research and table setting in an appropriate way. And if I'm doing my job correctly, you're just as excited about these things because I've told you how incredible they are.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's important to find those figures, those relatable names and the big stars, and not just telling those stories, but telling stories of the entire league. Maybe that opens the door to new viewership and new audiences, but holding on to that new audience with even more stories and nuances. Jane, I'll ask you a very similar question. Just how have you been able to get people to rally around your vision, not just for the PWHL, but also for investment in women's sports as a whole?
Yeah, when we talk about strategies to get people to invest in women's hockey, I think, I already touched on it a little bit, but our want and the importance we've placed on thinking outside the box and being different and being innovative and being creative. I think that's been a very purposeful strategy that we've put in place with our league. So that's one thing. I think the second one, and it touches on a little bit what Elle was saying, is just around the athlete first mentality. So telling their stories. We were built on the shoulders of our athletes. They started something called the Professional Women's Hockey Players Association, and those players advocated for 4.5 years and rallied and built a business plan and really tried to get this league off the ground, what turned into be the PWHL. So we have a very strong connection and I think a unique beginning with our athletes. And our athletes were at the table negotiating the CBA before the league even launched. And that's the first for any league that we're aware of, to have a collective bargaining agreement in place before league launch. So having women at the table negotiating for themselves, we have great coverage around moms, people that need support for daycare. There's things that are very specific to the women that having them at the table makes us different, makes us unique. And so we have all these, as I said many times, incredible athletes, incredible stories, and making sure that we have this athlete first mentality, because as we all know, based on numerous research we've seen, the next generation of fans follow the stars. They're not necessarily as loyal to teams as past generations have been. They want to follow stars and they want to follow them in ways where they get to know them, learn their stories, and really follow their path through professional sports. So we'll continue to put our athletes at the forefront and have them help sell the league and the sport.
Feeling empowered to advocate for yourself and your team and your league, it has been so empowering to me, seeing the WNBA and the women's national soccer team and the PWHL do that for themselves, not even just doing it, but having the support from the people around them to feel the strength and the empowerment to do it. It is so cool to watch that unfold. I've asked y'all a ton of questions. Enough of questions from me. We've got a bunch of questions from some people watching, so we'll get to some of those, and please feel free to send those questions in for Jayna and Elle. Jayna, let's start with you. This question that we have from the audience. Really interesting question. In your opinion, how does accessible women's fan merchandise influence the growth of women's sports, and what are the leagues doing to support this?
It's a great question. We knew upon launch that this women's sports merchandise has been a thing for a number of years where people just can't get it. You love to watch and follow your female sports stars, but you can't find a jersey anywhere. You can't find a t-shirt. And that was a challenge that we knew was going to be there. We stocked up very purposely as best we could in a very short period of time upon league launch, and we still couldn't keep up with the demand. So we, in recent months have brought on somebody that's focused strictly on merchandise for us. We have big plans entering into season 2, but we know that demand to be able to be able to buy merchandise for either your team or your favorite player is so important. And I think, without sharing too much, we have a great strategy in place that will hopefully satisfy all of our fans in being able to follow along and buy merchandise from their favorite athletes starting next season.
We've seen it with the iconic orange WNBA hoodie. That's the cool thing to wear, the Caitlin Clark jerseys. Absolutely, that has an impact, not just on investing into leagues, but also spreading awareness. Seeing someone walking around in the street wearing their favorite PWHL t-shirt, their favorite team, it's absolutely impactful. Elle, did you have something that you'd like to add to that question?
I did actually, and I pulled it up because I did a panel maybe about a month ago where we sort of talked about this, and I pulled some numbers for that. So I just pulled them up really quickly, and some of the research shows that, again, despite the boom that we're seeing surrounding women's sports apparel only makes up about 15 to 20% of the total market. Like the idea that we are investing more money in women designing outfits for the NFL as opposed to having a readily available shoe for these women or jersey for this women. I do think that sort of the next breed, I know some people that are involved in the NWSL and in some of the teams that are coming, some of the expansion teams. And one of the first things that they did, apart of course from trying to build a really great roster and PR and all of those things and building within the community, is make sure they had a very robust merchandising plan. Because to your point, I mean, we're reaching this point where I work with a lady who said that her son the other day came home and was like, I brought Sabrina Ionescu's shoe. And she did this whole like, I raised an ally. I'm so proud of you. I can't. And he was just like, Mom, I bought it because I thought the colors play was cool. Like, that's where we need to get to. There is so much brand loyalty, Jayna hit on it, between fans of women athletes and the merchandise that they buy. We need to make sure that it's readily available. And again, sort of going back to the stunt casting thing, making sure that it's not performative. And having that, I have the Everyone Watches Women's Sports that Together released. And every time I wear it out in public, someone runs up to me and is like, I have been trying to get that t-shirt for 6 months. Like, where can I get it? And I think that's a problem and a shame. So yes, like we have a huge discrepancy there, and something that I believe expansion teams and expansion leagues are really starting to focus in on, because that is a huge aspect of it as well. I think for so long we sort of ran away from like the cosmetic part of it. And now again, we're going back to embracing that. Like, I remember covering women's basketball even a few years ago, and it would be like, do we really want to show them walking in? Like, we're objectifying them. We're making it about their outfits. And I'm like, well, we show the men, don't we? In their horrible outfits and their leather jackets and I think that, we're embracing that now, that it is about culture and fashion and all of these things that makes it uniquely female centered. So I completely agree with Jayna there. We got to do a better job.
I don't want to deter anyone from taking fashion risks, but yeah, we've seen some pretty brutal outfits from the men for sure. But I think a theme that you've hit on, Jayna, is accessibility. How easy is it for me to find my favorite women's team's apparel? How easy is it for me to turn on the TV and watch women's sports? Another question from the audience. Elle, I'll ask you first. What advice do you have for anyone who wants to make a career shift into the women's sports industry?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is, and I go back to sort of that role of being versatile, is what are you providing? Like, what is your voice going to provide to the market? And that doesn't mean that you need to spend a ton of time thinking about your brand. It just means that what do you think is missing from this space, and how are you filling that void? I also think that, if you're thinking about and preparing to sort of make a pivot, obviously it depends on what kind of pivot. Do you want to be on camera? Do you want to be off camera? But it's just being very well researched and knowing your information. The good news is, as I mentioned before, the growth and boom of women's sports has over-indexed the resources behind it. So a lot of times we find that these companies are really leaning on the experts here because they just don't really know what to do. So I do think there's like a huge opportunity in particular to try and outfit the media landscape with people who are specifically there for women's sports, but it would be about trying to figure out what's missing in the diaspora of voices that surround it, how you provide that, and then just being as well researched as possible. Figuring out like as much as we love track and field, and certainly we saw the women show up and dominate in the Olympics, you have to be realistic about where they sort of fall in the hierarchy of things. So if you're a track and field person and all you want to do is highlight, female track and field stars, understanding that you're going to have more limited opportunities than if you were going to be covering basketball or gymnastics or softball. So sort of figuring out what's that next great thing that you can wrap your arms around and sort of be on the forefront of, that would be my best advice. That's how you cut through. Absolutely. Jayna, if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, that was a great answer. I think what I would add to it is, there's lots of great conferences, conventions where you can go and meet a lot of people in women's sports. And I think much like our female athletes, I've found people working in women's sports are very accessible. They want to talk about it. They want to share. They want to help. They want to mentor. So, if you can break into that network of people, I think you'll find a lot of support there as well. And I would just say, in my experience, people that are working in women's sports bring a ton of energy, a ton of passion. They want to do something different. They want to, be part of something different. And I know for us, we really pride ourselves on our diversity and bringing in people with different backgrounds, different experiences, bring different things to the table. And I think across the board, you're going to find that in women's sports. So I think, just that accessibility again, when it comes to meeting people, tapping into networks, and bringing that energy to the women's sports space, because there's a lot of it right now.
If I could add really quick, a specific one that I found to be a great resource to me when I was first starting out was WICT, Women in Cable Television. And that covers people in front of the scenes, behind the scenes. In fact, it's predominantly people behind the scenes, but there is pretty much a chapter in every single major city. And so maybe looking into your local WICT chapter who holds events and the national events as well would be a really great place to start too for the networking.
Absolutely. I would also add AWSOM, AWSM, the Association of Women in Sports Media, another great tool at your disposal and a great network of women in this industry. I told you guys I had I was done with questions. I lied. I have one more just to kind of put a bow on our wonderful conversation today. Jayna, I will start with you. We know that sports have been touted as the great unifier, even in the midst of fandom and competition. And although winners are most certainly celebrated in all sports, and of course in women's sports as well, many athletes are also hailed for their sportsmanship and how they cultivate relationships across identities because of that shared experience. It's one of my favorite things about sports. And I think about, if you go back to the Paris Olympics, Simone Biles and Jordan Childs bowing down to Rebecca Andrade after she won gold on the floor. It was something that made me incredibly emotional to see that kind of sportsmanship. So why is it so important to establish a culture of belonging, especially in women's sports?
Well, when we think of belonging in women's sports, I think, one of our biggest values, I think, and I just touched on it, is the remarkable diversity that we have within our sport and within our athletes who represent a large number of various groups of folks. And in our fan base, we see the exact same thing. And in talking to a number of our fans, I think we provide a space for them where they feel welcome. And I think there's a large portion of the sports world and the sports industry and the environments where many people have not felt welcomed. So to be able to create that sense of belonging within our league has been something that has been so important to us. And I think also as female athletes, and us being in hockey, which is has been a traditionally male-dominated sport, you have all these women that have sort of always gone against the grain. And I think that resonates with people that have maybe not felt safe and included in the sports space before. And now we continue to try to create this environment where everyone feels welcome and everyone feels like they can find a sense of community and belonging with our league.
Absolutely. A community is so huge, especially for groups that might feel underrepresented in the sports industry. Elle, I'll pass that on to you as well if you'd like to add.
I love, Caroline, that you brought up, Simone Biles and Jordan Childs. I know they got a little grief from, some big loud-mouthed former football player about how weak sauce that was. But to me, it really symbolized the beauty of women and women in sports. And that is that we can be the ultimate competitors, and we want to win, and we are tough as nails, and we are crafty. And in some ways, we've got enforcers. I mean, certainly in hockey, we make up every type of athlete that you can think of. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we'll also run over and help you if your wig falls off while you're in the middle of a game and we want to save you from embarrassment. We look out for each other in a way that is so unique to anything involving a predominantly sort of female space. We are the most inclusive space that exists. All are welcome in this space. And I know coming into this space just a few years ago in women's basketball and still feeling like a newbie. I've loved women's sports my whole life, but I hadn't covered it. And I felt a little bit like an imposter and like I was jumping on a rocket ship that had already taken off. And I felt some kind of way about it. And it couldn't have been a warmer space. And that, I think, is indicative of what women's sports is. We want you here, no matter who you sleep with, no matter who you look like, what you look like, no matter where you're from, what your gender is. It doesn't matter. All are welcome here. That has always been our edict. And so I think that making sure that we are rooted and grounded in that so that we create a safe space for not just the athletes, but for the people that love those athletes, for the fans. Mm-hmm. We want to be sort of the gold standard of inclusivity, diversity, representation, and sisterhood. And I think it turns every trope on its head when you see those two world-class gymnasts bowing down to another. That to me is so beautiful and wonderful. And that's why I love being in this space, because it is so incredibly supportive. It's competitive, but we can put down our whatever it is, sticks or gloves. And at the end of the day, we're all there for a deeper purpose and meaning. Every one of those women that takes the ice in Jayna's league or takes the court, when I cover them, is there for a bigger purpose, bigger than themselves. They know that, and they carry so much. And I'm just so proud to be a part of it.
So well said. And it's so important to understand that both things can exist at the same time. That women can be competitive and get nasty and trash talk and be at the pinnacle of their respective sports. And also at the end of the day, have so much respect and support for every other person, no matter what they look like in that league and in that space. Both things can exist at the same time.
Yes.
Elle Duncan, Jayna Hefford, thank you both so much. I am blown away by everything that you've shared. My cup is overflowing. I'm feeling inspired, and I'm sure that everyone listening also feels the same way. So appreciate you for taking the time to have this very important conversation with our audience. I know both of your schedules are incredibly busy, but if you didn't already know, you are officially part of the Makers community. So thank you so much. We look forward to supporting and uplifting both of you as your journeys as change makers continue. So thank you both so much. I really appreciate it. The future of women's sports is now. So thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
And thank you to everyone for joining us at the first ever Makers LinkedIn Live. Makers is excited to continue building community across our social platforms and in-person events. So follow at Makers Women and at Yahoo Sports on all social platforms for more insightful storytelling as we move toward equity. Thank you so much again. I'm Caroline Fenton, and we'll see you next time.